I think when you have been in the leadership seat, you intuitively feel what it is that you need to know from the PMs who are on your team
Mm.
and what the expectations are that are coming from the executive team and the board. And if you haven't viscerally felt that yourself, I think you don't necessarily see how high the stakes are a lot of the time. You don't necessarily think about, okay, so we need to figure out a launch that is not just going to make users happy, but it's actually going to bend the revenue curve of the entire company up and to the right. That's a tall order. And I think a lot of the product zeitgeist talks about talk to users and deliver on user value. And that's great. But you have to zoom out higher level and think about the competitive landscape and think about strategy and think about taking a hard right turn and all of these degrees of freedom that I don't think you're trained to think about as an IC otherwise.
Welcome to another episode of the Supra Insider podcast. This time, Ben and I were joined by Katie Kent. Katie was actually one of our first Supra members, and she has a cool journey. After a couple of years in a product leadership role, she recently decided to become an IC again as a staff PM at Semgrep, which is an application security tool used by amazing companies like Figma, Lyft, Dropbox, and many others. Katie is also a two-time founder, and she loves advising and investing in early stage companies as well. In our conversation, we covered why Katie went into the security industry in the first place and why she loves it. We also touched about on why she decided to go back into being an IC after leading teams for a couple of years and how being a manager has actually helped her become a better IC. We also went deep on how she likes to work with designers and what great collaboration looks like between product and design. And then finally, we also touched on the pros and cons of remote versus in person environments for PMs and much, much more. I learned so much every time I talk to Katie, and I'm sure you will too. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Katie. So excited to have you here.
Yeah, excited to be here. Hi, Marc. Hi, Ben.
Thanks for joining
Uh,
us.
yeah, super excited for this for a lot of reasons. Katie was one of our first, I believe, like 14 super members, which is
Yeah.
incredible. Thank you for taking a crazy chance for this guy that just had an idea. And also, I think what's really cool about you, you've had such a cool career and journey. You've been a founder, you've been in many industries. So, yeah, maybe the first question for you, you've spent the last 3 years in security. You're in your second role or second company in security. So, I'd love to hear like why security and why do you think it's cool?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'm excited to get that question because I think security doesn't get a lot of attention within kind of product leadership communities typically. I think that sometimes in tech in general, security is thought of as, oh, there's kind of these nerdy people in the corner and they do stuff that we have to comply with because reasons. But I think the more I've gotten into security and learned about why it exists as a field, it's actually super relevant to the international stage and to what's important for our country. Basically, cybercrime is a thing that is happening all around us all of the time without most people thinking about it or noticing it on a day to day basis. And ultimately, what security exists to do is to prevent cybercrime. And some of that is people in a basement somewhere in the world. And some of that is nation states who have aims against the United States of America. And I think it's something that I hope more and more people get interested in over the next 5 to 10 years.
And I'm curious, did you have an intention into getting into security or did it just randomly happened?
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in things that are more on the technical side. So I worked in data science and machine learning. I worked on supply chain data analysis products and always had some interest in that. But I was actually pretty resistant to working in security the first time. There was a friend of a friend who was the VP of product at this company called Panther. This guy, Eric Goldman, who actually co founded Vanta. And he really pressured me to consider the role, not pressured, pressured in a good way, you know? And wasn't super excited about the security aspect at first, but I think it's one of those fields where the deeper you get into it, the more you appreciate it and the more you want to learn about it.
I
What's the
want
most surprising thing to you about just being a product person in the security space for those of us who have never worked in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's how many people in security care like in a mission way about being on the blue team. A lot of times it reminds me of the military, right? There's like very much like a service mentality to this, like being the international private police, if you will, of the internet and trying to protect the information of millions and millions of people, including all of our grandmothers, right? Because all that stuff is out there.
So what you're saying is, unlike a lot of companies that maybe say they're making the world a better place and try to get people to drink the Kool-Aid, security companies actually deliver quality Kool-Aid to the employees because it's not hard to connect the dots between the work that you do and why like regular people are better off because you are doing what you're doing.
Yeah. I think the reason it's surprising is like there's communities out there of people who want to do good for the world with tech, right? And I think a lot of people think about climate and healthcare and education as the main pillars of tech that's good for the world. And people don't talk about security in that context. But if you think about it, it really is an area that, makes the world a better place to have security of our information, both of like our state secrets, our corporate secrets, and just like people's data about like their credit card numbers and their financial history and all that stuff like deserves to be safe.
I feel like every day now I see something in the news about how passwords and data has been breached. And are we gonna get to a point where we're gonna stop having breaches, or do we all just need to just be like hyper vigilant forever until we die about all of our data?
I hate to break it to you guys, but um, the
We're
the
screwed.
weather forecast is more breaches and not fewer. If you think about LLMs, right? Like we just democratized hacking. What's the biggest barrier right now to being a hacker is learning how to code is still really hard. But learning how to code just got so much easier because you can go talk to ChatGPT and you can go talk to Claude and ask them what to do. And we have to assume people are out there by the hundreds of thousands using that for right now what are okay purposes, but in the future might be nefarious purposes.
Yeah, I feel like the reason why I think security is cool, or I'm like, okay, it makes a lot of sense that this industry is going to be around for a long time, is I feel like for me, it's such a no brainer to invest in security because like the consequence of not doing it are exponentially worse. So every time that someone is like, hey, you should get this, or I remember that like it was like maybe like 6 years ago, someone was like, hey, you really need a password manager and randomize all your passwords. And I was like, I'll pay whatever it is. And if one password like double their prices next week, I will happily pay it. So I think I just feel like that fear or that the ROI is so clear with security, which is really cool. Maybe another question before we maybe shift to another topic is something that Ben and I often discuss is the more technical a product is, the more helpful it is to maybe be technical as a PM or as a product leader. After being in security for 3 years, do you think that theory or thesis applies here as well?
Yeah, 100%. But also there's a limit to that. I would say one of the biggest challenges of being a PM in developer tools and the part of security that I work on is a developer tool. We work on like developer tools for application security engineers. So even more so that way. You have to be able to have an intuition for what's a good developer experience. A lot of people in security who are your users, they might not be engineers, but they are technical people. And so to have an intuition about that, like you have to be able to do it yourself. And I do think that there's just a lot of like hands on the keyboard time that you have to put in if you don't come from a technical background as a product manager to get to that level. And I think that the limit of that is sometimes I've seen folks who come into PM from engineering kind of struggle by jumping to solutions too quickly or not trusting their team enough or just not giving their team enough space to be the ones to lead on the solution. And so I think the blessing of never having worked as an engineer myself or never having coded professionally per se is I actually can't solve the problem myself. And so then I have to build like super strong relationship with my engineering leader and engineering team in order to ship products. And I think that kind of like collaboration and relationship is makes building some of the best products possible.
I told Mark that when it comes to PM roles, I don't know, something like Stripe, like working on developer tools, something tells me that you could be successful in that role without having been an engineer before. But I think the hurdle for, being good at that job is probably a lot higher if you haven't. So it sounds
Yeah,
like
for sure.
you've just figured a lot of things out through sheer hard work and like probably asking a ton of questions.
Yeah, a lot of it I think is being comfortable being uncomfortable. I'll tell you guys a quick little story. It's about how I got into tech in the first place. But I did not study anything quantitative back in college. I actually have a double major in international studies and Spanish. And when I was about 23, like more or less right after college, I helped start the first data science boot camp in America. And so we were teaching people about Python and how to use machine learning for business reasons. And I had no idea any of this stuff, right? I just had a lot of willingness to interview people in the industry and ask questions and Google things. And it's amazing when you look back and you realize how every single little question or Google kind of adds up. And then suddenly you're going toe to toe with experts in machine learning in the world. And you can just end up in things that you never thought were possible. And I think because everything is changing so fast, both in terms of the technology itself and the people working on it, that's one thing that kind of inspires me always, no matter if I'm working in security or I'm not, is that you don't need to have any particular kind of background to do any one kind of particular thing.
Yeah. So maybe the addition to our thesis would be like, you probably want to be technical if you're working in a very technical field, unless you're also like very self motivated to learn, to actually get your hands dirty and try new things. But cool. Another thing that I'm excited to talk about, Katie, is I know another big shift you've made recently is going from leading a team of PMs to now going back to as a super IC PM. I'd love to hear like, how has that been?
Yeah. For context for the audience, I previously was managing a team of up to 6 product managers, some people at the staff level. And then when I joined Semgrep about 4 months ago now, I came in as a staff IC and basically doing the job that I was previously managing. And there's a lot of interesting changes in that. I think the thing about it is if you truly love product, that means that you truly love building and shipping products that kind of push the world forward. The idea of giving something the internet has never seen before. And so a lot of times the core of that work is defining what to build and working with the team to build it. And you get not far away from that is the wrong word, but when you're abstracted from that in a leadership role and your hand's not on the steering wheel, right? There's just a bit of that edge that I think you do lose. And so I was really excited in this role to just have more time and more reps, I think, about it, of building the product myself, like hands on the steering wheel. And I think one of the reasons for that is I was thinking about the really long arc of my career, right? Like the 40-year arc. And I didn't want to look back in the future and think that I had graduated into leadership too early without having had enough time, like hands on the steering wheel, because I wanted to play the game, if you will, before coaching it for the rest of my career. And I think that's pretty uncommon to decide to do that yourself and to want to do that and be excited about that backwards from a lot of career advice, right? And paradigms around climbing the ladder. But I'm super happy. It's really fun just to be able to do the thing, right? To do the reason you got into product the first place and to feel super confident that I'll have as many years as I want to work to do the leadership thing and that will be there for me when I want
Yeah, for those not watching the video, you lit up when you talked about being back in the IC shoes, which I love. And Mark and I did talked a little bit about how the industry as a whole, I think, is applying a lot of pressure on companies to cut layers of management that might not be necessary, and product management is not immune from that. So a lot of people maybe didn't voluntarily make that transition like you did. And I think we've encouraged people to look at it as an opportunity to like re-engage with the fun parts of being a product manager, which is what a lot of us got into in the first place. So I love just like watching your body language as you describe that. And the question I was going to ask you, which is I was a manager of PMs briefly, so I don't have like a lot of PM managerial experience. Like did the transition into it and then shifted back into a full IC role after I did that. And I remember feeling like I approached the job a little differently, having like seen the way that the performance of ICs is managed. So my question for you is, has anything changed or evolved in the way that you're approaching your performance as an IC PM now that you've managed a handful of PMs before this?
Ben, I love that question. That's such a smart question. Yes, absolutely. I think when you have been in the leadership seat, you intuitively feel what it is that you need to know from the PMs who are on your team
Mm.
and what the expectations are that are coming from the executive team and the board. And if you haven't viscerally felt that yourself, I think you don't necessarily see how high the stakes are a lot of the time. You don't necessarily think about, okay, so we need to figure out a launch that is not just going to make users happy, but it's actually going to bend the revenue curve of the entire company up and to the right. That's a tall order. And I think a lot of the product zeitgeist talks about talk to users and deliver on user value. And that's great. But you have to zoom out higher level and think about the competitive landscape and think about strategy and think about taking a hard right turn and all of these degrees of freedom that I don't think you're trained to think about as an IC otherwise. And so there's no doubt in my mind I'm so much better as an IC having been a leader and gone back into it.
I'm also super curious about the inverse of that question. So now that you've gone back to ICing, like how do you think you would manage differently? Or maybe like another way to think about it is would you still find ways to still be involved in the execution and don't lose touch with that?
Yeah. I think for me, I'll be a bit vulnerable since we're amongst other product leaders here. The biggest lesson has been I realized I was actually good at leadership in product. I think I had a lot of imposter syndrome the first time I was a product leader. And part of that was I was in this director role and I was brand new to security and I was terrified I was doing things wrong all the time. But now, having gone back into an IC role, my manager now is also amazing, but I realized I was pretty good at that. And so that has been really helpful for my confidence about going back into leadership long term. And to your point about do I want to stay connected to the work? I think, yeah, I don't really see myself becoming a CPO with 4 layers of product people under me. I just don't know that is what would make me happy and feel creatively fulfilled. I think I'd always want to stay maybe 1 layer up from the PMs or something like that, stay in smaller organizations. But you also don't know until you get there, right? Like I said, 10 years ago, I was launching a data science bootcamp, which has absolutely nothing to do with building security developer tools. Who knows where the world will lead?
One thing Mark and I were also talking about recently was what's the right involvement for a product leader? So as I think about like a director or a VP of product or even whoever the highest ranking product person is at a company, what should their involvement be in the work that's actually happening on the ground? And also, should they have the ability to do the job of the PMs that are in their orgs? Given your experience, like has your thinking on the right level of involvement for product leaders and like the ICPM work changed? And how do you view it today?
Yeah, yeah. Did you guys see the founder mode article from Paul Graham within the last couple of weeks? Since you're probably on the Twitters, I think,
I've,
yeah.
I've never, yeah, what is that?
Yeah,
I've,
never heard
I've
of it.
never, yeah.
No? Okay.
Let's talk about it. Yeah. What was your takeaway from reading it? And then obviously would love to know how it ties to what we're talking about.
That is emblematic of, I think, what's a really big shift in the tech industry of now versus, let's call it 2016. During the zero interest rates era, everyone was hiring super crazy much. And people were measuring themselves on how quickly they could get someone hired, how good they were at managing, and all of these things. And I think in the recorrection that we've had and the sort of let's go back to basics on what is a good business and what is margin and all of these things, we've course corrected on that. And product is now being held accountable to are we shipping a good product that's delivering revenue in a way that wasn't true 8 years ago or something like that? And I think this is a really good thing for the industry overall. But I think it's also, you can think about how the founder mode is the CEO version of that. But what we're experiencing in product is the sort of scoped down piece of that for the product management function of, PMs, instead of being measured on hiring, are being measured on are you going and solving the bug? Are you going and selling the deal? And all of these kind of like play it down the fairway old school business mindset, which I think we lost some of that in the ZERP era of what really matters in just running a business at the end of the day. And so I think it ultimately is good for us as professionals and it's good for customers because it's holding ourselves accountable to where value really comes from. I'm curious what you guys think about this as well.
I agree with you that at a high level, there were a lot of things in the last, let's say, decade or the ZERP era where PMs were being evaluated based off of things that are not directly tied to customer value, like org contribution, like you said, like interviewing people and growing the org and doing like extracurricular activities for their companies. And like a lot of the stuff that we did in San Francisco in like the 2016 timeframe was just like crazy in hindsight. And not a lot of people are doing that now. So I think we are back to the basics. We're back to efficiency. I know from my friends that are still at like Meta, like a lot of middle management has been cut and a lot of people have had to go back into IC roles. So I think that's a good development. I the thing I am thinking through with founder mode for product managers is there's been as you move up as a product leader up the IC ladder, which we're trying to create an environment where moving up the IC ladder is as lucrative as moving up the management ladder. And if you move up the IC ladder, you're expected to make more of a strategic contribution. But if more founders and more VPs of product and chief product officers feel like it's their job to get into the weeds on the product execution side, it seems like there's like an increasing level of overlap between super senior ICs and the product executives because both are expected to care a lot about the execution and the strategy. So I just think it's something I'm keeping an eye on as it evolves, and I will be curious, kind of what's the actual where do the chips land when the dust settles on the relative responsibilities of the super senior ICs and the product executives and the CEOs, right? Because obviously they're, as part of founder mode, they're also supposed to own the product strategy.
Yeah, I want to respond to that really quickly. And then,
Yeah.
of course, still interested in what Mark has to say. I think there's kind of two pieces of being a staff IC, and one of those is the product strategy, and the other is the execution with the team. And I think if product leaders are going toe to toe with you on the strategy, that is good and healthy. And we didn't do enough of that, at least in my experience, like 6, 8 years ago in that time frame we're talking about. I think if a product leader is in the weeds on the execution, that might rile me as a staff IC because that feels like a sign of dysfunction. And I think it does push for more collaboration than we historically had on the strategy piece, which ultimately, like making those high stakes decisions, I think like having more eyes on it, more sounding partners, more depth of thought, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, I think my take there is that it's interesting. I think before the zero interest rate era, like you had a lot of executives that maybe hadn't done the role before. Like you had CPOs that didn't have a product background, that maybe were in sales or maybe were doing something completely different. And then they come in, manage the product. And I think if you bring it back to founder mode, this energy to go back to the craft, I'm not sure we're going to continue to see a lot of that. And I think the reason for it is, I think as the most senior product person, it is important to be able to have a very good opinion of what a good product looks like and be able to connect that with the business goals, right? I think at the end of the day, that's what you do. I think back to the best product leaders that I work with, they're really good at being able to jump from different altitudes. The moment of like, hey, actually, like I have a strong opinion about this pixel and this just doesn't look good, or I think this will be different, to also like, hey, how are we gonna monetize this? Or does the pricing and packaging make sense here? So I don't know. I think it's a good push to make sure that leaders are in touch with the craft. I think that maybe taking a step back to like on the founder mode article, I think different podcasts have said this too, but it's just a little bit incomplete. I think it's not black and white. A lot of interesting conversations came from it. So if that was the goal, I think mission accomplished.
I think just kind of synthesizing some of what we've been talking about and a lot of what Katie said, I almost wonder if instead of the kind of quote unquote ideal career path for product leaders in the future, instead of it being this IC to manager to executive, like linear and up to the right progression, maybe this kind of jumping back and forth between IC to manager to IC to that allows you to stay fresh. It allows you to avoid falling out of touch with the craft and what the right ways of doing things are. Because honestly, if you haven't done ICPM work in 10 years, like things have changed. Like the way of doing things and the amount of effort involved in doing certain things and the best practices around certain things have changed. And I find that the further you get out of touch with that, the kind of less credibility I also think you have as a leader. So I don't know if you have reactions to that, but in my mind, I've just been thinking about whether this is going to become more of the happy path of the way people think about their careers.
Yeah. One of the things that I think has changed the most, I wanted to double click on this piece for a second, is the relationship with design. So I think about what good looked like there 10 years ago you were whiteboarding in an office with a designer every day, right? When they were making things in InVision or Sketch or whatever those things were called. And going remote or hybrid plus Figma plus FigJam has made the PM designer collaboration look entirely different, right? I think some of the best teams that I've seen do a lot of workflow sketches in FigJam together, live with also the engineering team before any designs are created. This is like kind of tactical, but I think it's pretty important because it's like a fundamental shift in how these two functions are collaborating to build product. And if you don't, as a leader, have a clear vision for what good looks like in how your PM function works with your design function, that's like a big gaping hole in like one of the most important inputs to actually producing an amazing product. And I think that's a great example of how if you haven't touched it, done it yourself in a while, it's really hard to lead your team to be the best at it.
I agree. I think that the FigJam has completely changed the way that I work with. I still obviously work with designers, even though I'm not in a full time role. And most conversations start in FigJam, and we just take notes, and then you just start like wiring and sketching. And um, there used to be a time when everyone was in an office together, and you just walk by one of those offices, and there's like a glass wall, and you just poke your head in. What are you guys talking about? And then like you can just go in and just join. And I feel like FigJam is probably the closest thing to restoring some of that magic.
Yeah, I'm curious, is FigJam the tool you're using, Katie, to collaborate with designers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think I would probably make a lot of noise if we were using anything besides FigJam and get the organization to convert to it. That's how much I love this product. Like, it's an incredible product.
I think it's such a good example of, I know we're off topic, but just to like nerd out for a second, like one of the things I find that I love about FigJam is just how it takes these moments of collaboration and it turns them into delightful when okay, like good enough could have shipped and they could have left it at that, but they just seem to be taking the extra effort to like make collaboration feel fun, which I'm so happy about it because I think it's only a matter of time till they start publishing some like revenue numbers for FigJam. And I think people are going to start to realize that like creating delightful products that go above and beyond are a very good business decision. And I just love that about it.
I feel like Figma should be sponsoring this podcast right now. But I think one of my favorite examples of that is the high five feature. There's so many teams that I've advised or worked on where going to the exec of the execs and saying, we're going to spend X amount of time building a feature so people can high five in the product would be a non starter. And so I think it's incredible. It speaks a lot to the product and delight oriented culture that they have. That was one of the first things that they shipped. Not the first, but pretty early in their life cycle.
Maybe a fun thing that I would love to understand a little bit more depth. And I haven't worked with a designer for maybe like 2 years, but just like out of pure curiosity, like maybe like 5 years ago, what were you doing then, and what are you doing today with FigJam, and what part of the process is replacing, and then at what point do you then go back into actual mocks or PRDs? I'm super curious, like how does that process has evolved in your head?
Yeah, it's amazing because FigJam itself has evolved so much too, right? So 5 years ago, it was basically a digital whiteboard. I have to imagine that was like the genesis of the idea. And so you could put sticky notes and organize them, right? It didn't do much else. And I was using it a lot with designers 5 years ago for affinity mapping, right? Putting a bunch of ideas, clustering the ideas together and labeling them, which back in the day before that, gonna date myself, we used to do that with sticky notes physically on a wall, right? And then the designer would start a lot of times in Figma itself, right? But now FigJam has evolved enough where you can make things that look like software with only as many skills as you need to make a Google Slides. I have made and tested as a PM working with like a contract designer wireframes that you can put in front of people and do a usability test on. That is a game changer because it gives product a very easy way to go as far as they want to in the direction of doing like very basic testing even before engaging design. And so that kind of makes it even more important than ever to have an amazing relationship with your designer so that they don't feel like you're stepping on their toes if they do that. But I think how that manifests now is it just gives a lot of flexibility on a team of like, if right now I have this idea, but I don't even know if it's good, I can draw it out, I can show it to someone. Maybe the designer has a lot of bandwidth, they can do my user research for me while I do that. And I think it creates this ability to blur the lines between where product starts and design ends. And if you use that to your advantage, it can bring a lot to a team where you just have more redundancy in the system, right? You're not relying on one person to do every single step of the process. You can be in each other's brains more.
How do you walk that line? Because I totally agree. I feel like I've definitely gotten earlier in my career, I got in trouble with designers because I would go and come back with a piece of paper with a bunch of wireframes and be like, they're like, whoa, dude, like that's my job. Like your job is to figure out like what is the problem we're solving, and I'll figure out like how we solve the problem. When people say, oh, like this is basically allow bringing PM and design a little bit closer, I'm always concerned, be like, okay, like this seems like a perfect way to piss off your potential product designer counterparts. I'm curious, like, when have you found that's worth maybe doing some of those prototypes versus kind of letting them run with it? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah. To your point, I learned some tough lessons early on in my career also with that toe stepping vibe. And I think having been a founder and having managed teams, you learn a lot about expectation setting, right? And about having explicit conversations about what are you expecting from me? What should I expect from you? And how do we meet? And I think one of the ways that product and design can be optimally successful together is if at the beginning of working with a designer, because every designer is a special snowflake, every PM is a special snowflake, you actually just sit down and say, like, what do you like to get from a PM? What is too far? What would make you feel like I'm up in your Cheerios? When would it be okay for me to just draw something? And how could you feel safe with me doing that? And actually just proactively address it. And I think creating that psychological safety with someone that you're going to work with super closely pays a lot of dividends, but then also tactically it enables you to do whatever you want in terms of like your piece of the creative process.
It's interesting because I find that a lot of designers that I've worked with love when I get into their junk and try to show my ideas. And they're like, yeah, like I'll clean that up later. That's almost like they immediately discount what I'm doing anyway. I feel like maybe I haven't been threatening enough the designers to like trigger their alarm bells. But I find that a lot of the designers that I work with, things always start in conversation. And then at some point I'll be describing an idea and they're like, can we like just jump in and you show me? And I think 5 years ago, I would have to get into whatever the sketch file, or we'd have to get on a real whiteboard, or like you said, use sticky notes or something. And now I feel like FigJam allows, because it's an infinite canvas, like it's almost like the cost of doing dumb things has come down to zero because it's all like throwaway work, but you don't lose it. So I think instead of having a channel, like I used to have channels with some of the designers I worked with, and you look in the Slack channel and it's just like a series of pictures of whiteboards. And if you ever want to pick up where you left off, you have to recreate the whiteboard from scratch and then keep building on top of it. And now you just have this ability to like copy paste and just be like, let's leave that as it is. Here's how I was thinking about it. And then you just start like going ham on a version, and it doesn't feel like you're overriding what they said. You're just doing your own version of it. So I feel like the infinite space just, I think, is fundamentally more collaborative. And then I also think there's a guardrail in place against PM getting too solutiony or too high fidelity, because you literally cannot create like high fidelity designs in FigJam. And that's a feature, that's not a bug. That's like an intentional decision. So I think Figma is just like really smart in that they created literally two spaces. Like Figma really has become the primary space for designers. Like they own that, and other people come in, provide feedback and comments, but like they don't mess with things. And then FigJam has become, I think, the true collaborative space for everyone.
So much of that resonates with me.
I wonder, like, if in the future, like, part of Figma strategies is maybe going to be like with AI or something, like allowing people to move from like that FigJam to Figma file a lot faster, or maybe with less designers. I feel like that is just so ripe for that in a way. Like they have so much data, they have so much information. And I feel like, yeah, designers now probably spend most of their time after they thought about the solutioning, then they spend a lot of time like in that high fidelity, just making sure that it fits with everything, that it's beautiful, right? The flows, interactions. So I'm really curious if they are able to crack that. What will design look like in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I love this train of thought. I've thought quite a bit about there's all these things that we end up designing. I've mostly worked on B2B products in the last few years. All this time is thinking about how to design an elegant way, say, for example, to do RBAC permissioning for an enterprise application. And it's maybe not the very best use of the designer's time to design one more way for people to have a admin role, a read-only role, and a member role for an enterprise app. And so I think that the technology we have today is totally capable of taking the idea of an RBAC that supports XYZ, even like in a Notion PRD document, and then turning that into a design in Figma. And I'm wondering who's going to do it first. Is it going to come from Notion and they're going to put a button that says turn this into a FigJam file or Figma file? Or is it going to be Figma that's here's how to go from a FigJam to or a word in FigJam into a screen design? But I definitely see a lot of those kind of like repetitive, very schematized designs that we all have. Additional R factors, login flows, and password management, and all this stuff. I don't think that we're going to be hand rolling those in 5 years from now.
Yeah, and then it's like an interesting question of what is the highest leverage thing for a designer to do. And I think like bringing it back to the discussion that we were having around like the delight that there is in FigJam, like I actually think like maybe that's going to become the highest ROI thing, right? That makes your software unique, like those high five features or like the emoji voting, whatever that might be. I don't know.
I'm curious how you all feel about this like fun software making its way into the C-suite and like leadership teams for leadership level discussions, long-term planning. Cause like most of my experience with FigJam has been in this trying to make it fun to collaborate with like design and engineering. And I'm curious if you think that this kind of like fun software is going to increasingly penetrate like the C-suite.
What's an example of a C-suite tool that you're thinking about?
I'm just thinking of how like every company I've worked at had like leadership offsites where they'll get somewhere and they'll be like, let's plan the next, 6 to 12 months. And I'm not imagining them using FigJam for that. I'm imagining them getting together in some like Airbnb or hotel and just doing a bunch of whiteboarding sessions. And for some reason, it doesn't seem like I'm not hearing from the people I know in like leadership level, like VP, C level positions that like they're running all their leadership meetings now in FigJam like you would as a kind of like product team. So that's like the stuff I'm talking about.
Oh, I love this. Yeah, maybe not at a properly sized company, but I was working as the head of product for a little bit for this company, and we were trying to set our company and product strategy for the back half of the year. And I ran all of our brainstorming sessions out of FigJam, just the old business school SWOT analysis, like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. For anyone in the audience who's not familiar, yeah, I had the CEO and the other founders and everyone sit down and explain them the thing. And they were all saying, wow, this was a really effective way. Can we do this again next time? Just because you just get so much output, right, from an affinity mapping, and you know what everybody else thinks when you do the sticky dot voting with the stamps. And I think everyone feels heard in a process like that. And it's quasi democratic, but not too democratic. And yeah, so that was a startup, like a kind of Series A startup, but maybe, why not?
Yeah, I think part of it, the challenge too, is I think when I think about those board meetings or offsites, etc., like I think the challenge is that they make such an effort for them to happen in person that it almost feels like counter to bring something like digital into the mix. So then maybe like a lot of board meetings, like I've seen actually like you get a printout of the deck or you have the actual post-its when you're doing like working sessions. So it's an interesting like question of who's going to crack that conversion from the physical world into the digital world in a way that like it's actually works and it's useful and it doesn't require like a huge onboarding or ramp up. And I remember at Asana, we have these like Google Jamboards that you think about it like, oh, this is a great idea. Finally, I'll be able to collaborate with the people in New York or the people in Dublin. But I maybe used it once in 5 years. So I don't know. I think just maybe that's like the hardest challenge of like, how do you crack that bridge between physical and digital?
In the example I'm thinking about, we were at this offsite in actually Charleston, South Carolina, and this like big, enormous, beautiful Airbnb on the beach. And we were all sitting around a table in this outdoor patio with our laptops, not even using like one main screen. And so you're getting the in person just by being there together and sort of you're in the document together, you're seeing each other's ideas and writing really fast, but then talking about them live and going back and forth between that. And that felt like a really seamless hybrid experience. And then you can, close the laptops and literally take a walk on the beach and like go deep dive. And that definitely felt like living in the future in a good way.
I also agree that I've done that kind of like you're in person and everyone has their laptops out and you're making progress on stuff. And that's cool because someone could do something in the digital space that you can just comment on out loud and other people can chime in and that can spark a discussion and go for a walk, get lunch, whatever. There's a continuity to things that doesn't happen when you're at home and you close your laptop and then we're all back in our own little space. I was going to comment on another approach I've seen for this is when I was at Meta, we got the Quest headsets and Meta's working on this like workrooms product. So you can go into digital space with your colleagues and hang out around a room. And I would see like your avatars and facial reactions. And one of us could stand by the whiteboard and you could stand on a different part of the whiteboard and we could like move stuff. You could kind of see where it's going. And I think that it's pretty compelling. It's not there yet. I think it was like, and they know that you got to ship and iterate. But if you play it out, I think it's pretty interesting where it's heading, where there's a world where we could be having this podcast. If, for folks that haven't done this yet, I think Lex Friedman recorded a podcast with Mark Zuckerberg in the metaverse, and they had done I think it's like $50,000 is the price point right now to get full scanning, like a kind of like a body facial scan. But once you do that, if you put on one of the Oculus headsets, you could have a photorealistic conversation that's almost indistinguishable from reality. And that's pretty neat.
Do you feel like it's a good thing or a bad thing that
Well,
we can do that now?
I think the way so there's a security angle to all this that I will not comment on because I haven't thought about that much. But like, is this a good thing in the world? I think one thing I learned from my time at Facebook is the way that Mark communicates to the team why these things are good for the world. And I think, and he always has a really good rationalization in his head for why these things are good for the world. And his way of explaining this, why this is good, is because he doesn't think that virtual reality space is competing with the real world. He thinks it's competing with our current time on digital devices. So if you think about this conversation we're having, it's like we're each a square on each other's screens. We can't make real eye contact. We have to keep looking back and forth. There's lag and all these things. So theoretically, if this conversation was happening in a more immersive environment, that's the competitor to the VR is what we're doing right now. It's not us getting together for a meal in person, which we should still definitely do when we're all in the same place.
Yeah. Part of me buys that. Part of me, like, I also could argue the other direction if that, like, for example, with COVID, right? Or with remote work, right? Zoom has gotten really well, like really good. FigJam has gotten really good. And I think that's what has allowed companies to be remote, which means that now a lot of companies now are remote and are not that maybe would have been in person if the technology wasn't as good. So I just feel like the closer the experience is to feeling like in person, the hardest it is to make the argument that, oh, I should actually make the effort and meet in person. And I think also, like, as species, as humans, I feel it every day. Like when someone's like, hey, let's go grab coffee in a bar in New York, I'm like, oof, can we just do a Zoom instead? Because I'm like, think about like, oh, I'm actually going to have to get out of my sweatpants or my, home shorts and wear something and brush my teeth, whatever. No, I brush my teeth. But it's just like this whole, like, the barrier of entry to just getting out of the house is so much higher once you're used to like working from home. So I don't know, like that's my push against it. But I'm curious. Yeah, Katie, what do you think?
This actually, for me, brings up something I want to talk to you guys about as well, which is like return to office and return to hybrid and how that impacts product roles. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, go there.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Because I think product is one of these functions that you produce specs, sure, as like a written artifact, but a lot of your job, it is the meetings, it is the people time, it's the FaceTime, all these things. And I ended up in this role at Semgrep taking this hybrid position where you're required to be in the office 3 days a week. And I've been doing product remotely for about 4 years before this. So I've been thinking a lot about remote PM versus hybrid PM and real life PM and how these things are different. And I do think that it feels like a superpower now just to be able to walk up to the engineer's desk and say, hey, that bug that I really need fixed, what's going on? And I think there's a much like lower barrier to entry asking for help, like when you're in person or just throwing an idea by someone. And one thing I think about is how the flip side of that is pretty much everyone I know who's in a similar situation where they have a return to office or they're in a hybrid role. You end up in all of these meeting rooms where there's 4 of you in real life and there's one person who's working from home today or based in New York or whatever it is. And so you're all in real life looking at a screen together. And that's not a better experience. And I don't have a clear point to make on this, but just curious with you guys talking to so many PM leaders, like what thoughts you've heard about how like hybrid and return to office play into PM culture.
I don't think anyone has figured it out fully, is my sense. I think everyone still feels like we're in the figuring it out stage, and everyone is just becoming painfully aware of the trade-offs. And having days of the week where everyone is at the office, my sense has given teams, it's almost like discussions start reorienting around that so that collaborative days happen and certain discussions happen when you're in the office. And then there's just an expectation that maybe less collaboration happens or you get your actual work done on the days where you're not at the office. That's the cleanest I've seen it play out, where there's just no exceptions. You're not allowed to be that one person that's not at the office on the days when everyone's at the office. And maybe you get a few days a year where you can, if you get sick or you got to travel or whatever, there's exceptions. But if you break that rule too many times, you're just not following the code of conduct at the company, and you're probably going to have to be like go or something at some point. So I think that's probably some of the ways I've seen it play out, like with some success. But I think the moment that it's seen as a general, like it's like a guideline that you should be at the office, but no enforcement, then I think it falls into what you're describing, which is this 5 out of the 7 people at the office in the meeting are at the office, but then all 5 of them take the call from a different phone booth or from their desk. And it's like, or I guess we're not really collaborating at the office, are we? We're just having lunch together. And that's very different.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think you have to go either one extreme or the other. I think the middle is super tricky and it just adds so much cognitive load for everyone. And I think just like in general, just like a worse experience for everyone. And I'm curious, like, what do you think companies are not comfortable going one way or another? What do you think is stopping them from? Is it the fear of losing a lot of important people? Is it, yeah, what do you think is stopping companies?
Purely recruiting, I think. I talked to our recruiting team quite a bit, and I used to run a job placement company, so follow a lot of recruiting stuff. And it's way harder to recruit people for in real life roles. They're much less competitive, and I think there is a big cost for that. I think the second thing is a lot of companies have these people that were hired remotely during COVID that they want to continue to support and accommodate, and nobody wants to say, let's cut everyone who is remote and hired during COVID, because you, of course, have some really amazing people in that group. And so I think those are the two biggest reasons. I don't know. I would say, okay, I don't like the thing where there's, yeah, 5 of us in a room and 2 people on Zoom. It's not the best. But what I do really love is I think being in office 3 days and being home 2 days gives me time to actually write high quality product requirements documents. That was like one of the biggest challenges of being in office every day. And when engineers, designers can just come up to you and ask you something any moment of any day. Like, when do you actually do that part of your job? And so I think for product, it's actually kind of ideal to be able to get that face time, but then also be able to like actually realistically work on product strategy and make decks during the day and not be doing that at 8 p.m. at night, which I think a lot of us did when we went to the office 5 days a week.
On this topic, you've been a founder. So do you have different opinions about the in-office versus like remote thing when it comes to a founding team, like in that very early stage? My gut tells me there's magic that happens by being together in that super early stage that is absolutely impossible and to reproduce remotely, and therefore dangerous, because you really do need magic to happen to build a successful company from scratch. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to take a strong opinion on this and reserve the right to disagree with myself in the future, but I think it's insane to start a company remotely right now. I would, if I were to start a company again, I would absolutely start it in person. There's no doubt in my mind. I would have remote roles for some things. Like, I've had very successful remote EAs. I've had very successful remote backend developers. I have no problem with that. But the people who are deciding the direction of the company just has to be in person. That would be a non-starter for me personally.
Could you just unpack it? Because I don't disagree, but I think a lot of people maybe have their own reasons for believing that. What are yours?
Ooh, hard to explain, but I think, to put it in one sentence, it's hard to be mad up close. When you are doing something at the pre-seed stage, there are so many things that go so wrong all of the time, right? Every single thing I've seen, even if it was ultimately successful at that stage, there's just so many bumps in the road. And you have to feel like you're in the rowboat together in real time. And there's just an energy between humans that is impossible to make happen on a computer. And I think you need that physical energy to get through those tough times together and to maintain the feeling of we're on the same team working on the problem together. I just don't think you can do that on a computer, or it makes it a lot less likely and the risk isn't worth it.
It's crazy to me how, first of all, I fully agree with you. And it's crazy to me how there's so many founders starting companies remotely right now, some of which actually most of the ones I'm working with are doing that, if not all of them. And I think when they think of founders are super smart, super motivated to make their company successful. And yet when they look at the trade-offs, the pros and cons, they still land on remote is better. And I've been trying to figure out how they're rationalizing it because I similarly could not see myself starting a remote company given how in my mind you have to like zigzag multiple times like a day, and the overhead of zigzagging remotely, especially with time zone difference, it is so much higher. You're like, it's like you're hurting your ability to steer the ship. And so it's interesting to me that people still land on, yeah, and that's worth it. It's the benefits of being remote are so good, that's worth it.
I was gonna say, I think some people have particular like lifestyle setups with kids or dogs or family in the area or whatever, where it's either I'm starting this company remotely or I'm not starting the company. I could get behind that if that's the situation that one or both of the co-founders are in. But I think if at all possible, actually, I advised this founder. The company's called Prospect, and I actually really like the way that they did it. They had three co-founders, and they were in different places, and they all made a list where they stack ranked the top 10 cities for technology in the United States by how excited they were to live in each of them. And then they agreed, without looking at each other's lists, that they would take the city that ranked collectively the highest, even if it was no one's first choice, which is how they actually ended up in New York. It was nobody's first choice, but it was everyone's second. So they all moved to New York to start this company together. And I thought it was awesome just in general, but also like a good process for taking the commitment together.
I'm curious. I mean, Ben, it's interesting because I feel you work with a lot of founders, and a lot of them you work with them remotely. So I'm curious, like, way to pick the other side. Like, have you seen any positives on being remote?
For me as like a consultant or advisor, it's almost like the setup matches my commitment level to the company. Like I'm not part of the team full time. I am helping them. So for me being remote actually feels natural because I'm just like plugging in and plugging out and I'm async, and it's almost like it matches, it resonates with what I'm actually doing. So it feels good. And I've also been invited to some team offsites slash onsites. You know, it's funny how offsites are now onsites. But when teams get together in person and being able to be with people in person allows me to be better at building that relationship in person, allows me to be, I think, better as a fractional person. But that said, if every company that I was working with right now had an office down the street in Brooklyn and I could just pop in for whenever I wanted and have lunch with them and coffee and also just do some of our conversations in a more casual way and just walk up to a whiteboard, I feel like they would get more value out of me because the spontaneity of those interactions infuses energy into the team and it forces certain conversations to happen. It's almost like you could break them out of whatever the default is. As a consultant, you can come in and like question some of the basic things that they all agree on and ask why. And I feel like making time for that random interaction is just one of the benefits in general of in person. If there's a startup that's all together in person and they're thinking about working with an advisor or a consultant of some sort that's going to help them out, I would probably give extra bonus points if they're able to pop in regularly to the office and kind of feel out the vibe and be part of that vibe.
Maybe another question: have you found anything in the digital world to replace that randomness that happens when you're in the same place in person? Or is there any tool that you've used that this is the closest it gets to like that spontaneous popping in or rolling your chair or coffee chat in the middle of the hallway?
I can't believe I'm about to say this, but Slack huddles. Because
Mm.
I feel like everyone hates Slack huddles. Like they're not like super reliable and all these things. But if you have a company where people are super responsive on Slack, like just being able to click a button and talk to someone immediately, like that does actually work.
No, that's a really good one. I love Slack huddles. I think we had Heather Phillips on, who's director of product design at Slack, and we talked about. I've done my love spiel for huddles on that episode. But one that I've been doing more recently, and I'm just like increasing my frequency of doing this, is sending like 1 to 2 minute looms with my thoughts about things to the people that I'm collaborating with. Like, for example, one founder sent me like their latest FigJam or Figma rather, like flows for this new thing they're working on. So yeah, let me know if anything sticks out to you as like weird. And I just looked at it, recorded like a 3 minute loom with some thoughts, sent it to him. He got back to me with a question or another area, and I sent another 2 minute loom. Like the ability to just like use Loom to infuse the in-person stuff, I think is probably the closest I've come outside of just being on a call together. Because sometimes you'll say something on a loom that I think gets the other person thinking in a way that they wouldn't if you just wrote it out. Or at least that's how I feel. Is like video is just, for some reason, the medium is the message, right? Like it really does carry a different weight.
Yeah, I feel like Loom is the closest to rolling your chair into someone's desk, but without being able to interact face to face. But like you're seeing their screen, you're seeing them how they engage with the environment in a way. I feel like when I want to delegate something to someone, now the best thing that I do and the most efficient way of me doing it is like maybe recording myself like 2 or 3 times doing that thing and thinking out loud. And then I feel like that's okay, you're actually getting like and I've been surprised, like things that I thought would be really hard to delegate by doing that process, actually they become really like that person has been able to pick it up really easy. For example, like the editing of this podcast, I'm like, it took me maybe like a month to like kind of get to good groove to figure out how to do everything. Like I recorded myself editing 3 podcasts, and Tareem, who's recently joined Supra, in literally a month, like I feel like has been able to get really good at it, which is really cool to see.
Yeah, just to tie this back to the point we were talking about with collaborating with designers too, some of my favorite designers that I've worked with in the last 2 or 3 years would just like regularly send looms walking through the latest version of a design. And I found that's a really nice way. Like my friend Alex and I are talking about how like in 10 years, no one's going to do synchronous design reviews because like, why do you need to get people into a room to review something if you could share it with them over a loom and not get interrupted? What if you could just tell the story uninterrupted for 5 minutes and just explain, here's the rationale, here's the decisions I made, here's the why I didn't do it this way, what do you think? Versus getting interrupted like 2 minutes in. So anyways, I feel like that kind of stuff where you just really have to nail the narrative. It's probably even better in Zoom than it is in person.
Yeah, funny thing you mentioned that during COVID at Asana, the way we do product reviews, we'd basically record a loom of us walking through the presentation of the designs or the thing that we're going to do. And then we just spend the synchronous time just actually going like through the meaty questions or things that like the execs were not aligned. And I found that was like such a better use of everyone's time. So I'm sure there's like a similar thing with, design reviews as well.
Yeah, I thought of another one, and it's not so much like replicating in person, but it's a superpower versus what you would do in person. We have one team at Semgrep that I work with on infrastructure, and they have this amazing habit of live transcribing their meetings collaboratively. So you'll have 3 or 4 people on the call, and while someone is talking, someone else will just, without discussing it, start writing down what they're saying, at least in the main points. And then sometimes people will go back earlier in the conversation if a point is revisited and then add the update to that appropriate section. And so you're making a collaborative live summary of the meeting while you're on the meeting. And so I think when you're talking about really complicated technical details of things, just to be able to make sure that everyone is following along and can look at it and make sure that they understood, you actually just get more done. And I've never seen a team do anything like this before, and it's super cool.
That's awesome. Okay, I think I could keep talking for a couple more hours, but I want to be respectful of your time, Katie. So yeah, maybe to wrap things up, 2 final questions for you. One is, where can people find you? And then the second one, is there anything that our audience can do to be helpful to you?
Thank you for that question. People can find me. I'm occasionally on Twitter. I'm at Katie Kent on Twitter, but the number 80 instead of how you usually spell Katie. And I do lurk more than I post, but I am on there. And in terms of being helpful, I'm always happy to chat with anyone who's excited about technical B2B products. And I think if I had one ask for the group, it would be if you do not use a password manager, one password, or anything like that, please go get one password, please. And that will be a thing that you'll probably be grateful for sooner rather than later. And yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's been super fun chatting with both of you. I feel the same, like we could go 3 more hours talking about all of these kind of topics. So appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all day.
It was a lot of
Amazing.
fun. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Katie.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Mark a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.